briefly, I am the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at NDSU. Our mission is to inspire democratic participation in social and ethical issues affecting the Northern Plains and beyond. And we do this by asking two questions. What kind of world do we want to live in, and how do we get there? This particular talk today, this public forum, is the first in a series of programs on free speech and academic freedom that will extend through the entire semester. The programming is sponsored by Tri-College University, Humanities North Dakota, NDSU Student Government, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and of course the Northern Plains Ethics Institute. Professor Amna Khalid work focuses on modern South Asian history and the history of medicine. Growing up under a series of military dictatorships, she has a strong interest in issues relating to censorship and free expression. Last year, she served as the inaugural John Stuart Mill Faculty Fellow at Heterodox Academy. This academic year, she is a senior fellow with the study of liberalism and a free society at the Institute of Humane Studies. Khalid hosts a podcast called Banished, which explores what happens when people, ideas, and works of art come into conflict with modern sensibilities. Professor Snyder studies historical questions about race, national identity, and the purpose of public education in the United States. He wrote the 2018 book, Making Black History, The Color Line, Culture, and Race in the Age of Jim Crow. Snyder has an interest in issues of academic freedom and free expression, especially as they relate to liberal arts education. Together, they have written numerous pieces about academic freedom and free expression and how these issues intersect with social justice concerns in campus diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Their co-written works have appeared in really great places, such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, and the New Republic. Let's welcome our speakers.
Thank you to Dennis for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the Northern Plains Ethics Institute for sponsoring this event. I've also received word that the NDSU Student Government is also sponsoring this event, so we're grateful to them as well. And thanks to all of you for showing up or tuning in if you are appearing on Zoom. All right, so over the last 5 years, free speech has gotten a bad rap, at least in certain quarters. And why is that? Like so many issues, masks, critical race theory, climate change, free speech has joined the culture wars. Fox News, Breitbart, The College Fix, and other conservative media have embraced the free speech mantle, arguing that there's a free speech crisis on college campuses, with conservative voices ignored, dismissed, or shouted down. Many liberals and progressives now see free speech as a conservative or a right-wing cause. The Trump presidency provides some essential context here. You had colleges, campuses explode with controversies surrounding the appearance of incendiary speakers such as Ann Coulter, Milo Yiannopoulos, pictured here, and Richard Spencer. So for many young people, for many college students, their first real introduction to debate surrounding free speech have been tied to the question of whether neo-Nazis, conservative trolls, and right-wing flamethrowers should be allowed to speak on campus. This unfortunate fact has led some students to conclude that the right to free speech is effectively a license to offend and oppress historically marginalized groups, especially people of color. In this view, free speech is nothing more than a weapon of the rich, the powerful, and the privileged. Amna and I are going to contest this view of free speech, which we see as cynical and misguided. And we're going to make our case for the many virtues of free speech in two parts. This is going to be a little bit unconventional. In part one, Amna is going to share some personal reflections in the form of a letter to her brother. In part two, picking up on some of the themes that Amna touches on, I will do a more formal presentation on the merits of free speech, arguing that it's essential for three things: self-expression, democratic government, and the pursuit of knowledge.
Well, thank you for having us. And as Jeff mentioned, we're doing this a little differently. It's a bit of an experiment, so I'm interested to see how it goes down. I'm going to read to you a letter that I wrote to my brother Mani. We both moved away from Pakistan, which is where I come from. And this is a letter where I was reflecting on the experience of having done that. Mani, my darling, darling Mani, what a ways the two of us have come. From the long, lazy days of Ammi's home-cooked meals and family chatter, with all of us huddled on her bed in Islamabad, Pakistan, to where we are now, you in the endless grey that runs through your years in Britain, now visible on the hairs on your face, and I enduring my 10th Minnesota winter. We've taken to our new homes quite seamlessly. You've internalized the sorry reflex of the Brits, and I, as you point out every chance you get, have inadvertently started mimicking the American accent that grates on you so much. And though we never dare to speak about it, we know that there are oceans of losses that we have buried deep within us. The June mornings of fall, the warmth of the winter sun, the oppressive dry heat of the summer months, and the intensity of the monsoon rains punctuated by days of stifling humidity that would only let up with the next downpour, and the cycle would begin once again. But that was not the suffocation that you and I ran away from. Our escape, if you will, was from a different kind of claustrophobia. You not being able to write in ways that challenged reigning orthodoxies, and me, a young woman with too many ideas, hungry for intellectual stimulation, challenging all norms and limitations. Flamboyant and outspoken, we flirted with the idea of crossing the line of what was acceptable, but only in our small circles of other misfits. For me, the closing in of the walls came into focus for the first time that unforgettable evening in February 1989. I remember we could hear the mob outside the American Cultural Center, which was miles from our house. You turned on the TV and we watched it happen live, the riots protesting Salman Rushdie's satanic verses. The streets were teeming with thousands of zealots after the Ayatollah Khomeini declared a fatwa against Rushdie for writing a novel that allegedly insulted Muhammad and Islam. The atmosphere was chilling. I was only 10 then, but the gravity of the situation wasn't lost on me. In the following months, we sat night after night watching riots ripple across the globe, for Rushdie had committed blasphemy. Certain Muslims were offended, and their offense was translating into terror and violence. It was only in the wake of the Rushdie affair that I fully came to appreciate the expansiveness of the notion of blasphemy and the legal infrastructure within Pakistan that gave it teeth. I started reading the newspaper, and of course, it was all too apparent for anyone to see, even to a 10-year-old, how these blasphemy laws became a tool for repressing and dispossessing non-Muslims. How these developments gave license to the outright targeting of non-Muslims hit home for me a year later when my friend Asha's neighbor was shot in his own driveway by a group of vigilantes. As I cast my mind back, I can see my dumbstruck 11-year-old self holding Asha's hand in school the next day, both of us terror-stricken as she recounted how she and her father heard the shots, ran outside, helped load her neighbor's bleeding body in the car, only to have him declared dead when they got to the hospital. It was around then that I consciously started paying attention to the politics of the times. The misogyny entrenched in the hudud and zina ordinances that resulted in rape victims becoming criminally liable for offenses against them, the systematic purging of progressive teachers and professors, the ideological tyranny that shaped the curriculum in public schools and universities, media censorship, and the erosion of democratic institutions across the board. Remember when all newscasters were told that they had to cover their heads? And when dance performances were categorized as obscene and hence banned? Oh, and the time when we walked to Jinnah Market for ice cream and this man came up to me and told me that I should cover my head. We were both so stunned and frightened that we said yes and walked on, neither one of us daring even to comment to each other on the absurdity of what had happened. Oh, and how can I forget that time when some low-ranking cleric declared a fatwa against you for walking into your classroom with a cup of tea in the middle of Ramadan when you were teaching English to 7th graders. You always were absent-minded. That was a close call. A lucky escape for you that no major media outlet picked it up. It's not that I hadn't felt the suffocation before that. The fateful marriage of religious dogma and political ideology under Zia's dictatorship birthed the blasphemous mindset that permeated all aspects of our lives. I remember in school, each time I voiced my inquisitiveness, disapproval awaited me. There was the Pakistan Studies class. When I asked about the role of Muslims in the killing of Hindus and Sikhs during the partition of India, I was shut down and told it was they who started the killing, not us. Once I dared to wonder out loud if we would have been better off in a joint India, and Miss Nausheen gave me a look that still sends shivers down my spine. At the next parent-teacher meeting, my report card said, Amna is intelligent, but she asks disruptive questions in class. It wasn't much better in college for me either. I was hoping, rather naively, that going to a private college would give me the freedom I so desperately craved. In some ways it did, but only because I got savvier at navigating the obstacles. It didn't take me long to see the shallowness of the seemingly liberal atmosphere of the school. Yes, of course I had inspirational teachers like Khurram and Ali and Hassan, who opened a whole new world for me intellectually. But there was a darker side to it all. While a handful of us were looking to these professors to widen our horizons, a number of other professors were recruiting students to the Tablighi Jamaat, a fundamentalist religious organization. Remember Zain, who was dating my friend Maryam? One day, out of the blue, some students invited him for a Tablighi session at Raiwind. And then one fine morning, Maryam came crying to my dorm room. He broke up with me. He says, dating is anti-Islamic. And sure enough, 2 days later, he changed his entire persona. Just like that, Zain went from being a cool guy who sported stonewash jeans and U2 t-shirts to wearing shalwar kameez, growing a beard, and refusing to make eye contact with women, let alone shaking their hands. And you know what, Mani? He wasn't the only one. I don't think I ever told you what happened to Asim. Once in a gender studies class, he said something about the unfairness of Islamic law, and he was hauled before the college's disciplinary committee to educate him. And Tahsin, the Pakistani-American professor teaching the course, she was the idealistic sort who'd returned from the US in the hopes of giving back. Well, she ended up being forced out by the administration. Teaching Judith Butler in Pakistan, that was her crime. At the end of that semester, when she told us she decided to move back to the US, I offered to help pack her office. She and I, we both sat on her office floor, taping boxes heavy with books, much like our hearts with sadness. But Mani, as always, I digress. Where was I? Ah, yes, the Rushdie affair and what that meant to us. Back then, the way the West came to Rushdie's rescue and scoffed at offense as a rationale for limiting expression was an unexpected comfort. Britain provided police protection for Rushdie and even broke off diplomatic relations with Iran. Imagine that. To live in a place where no one stops you from dressing the way you want, no vigilantes telling you what you can or cannot say, where asking questions in class is rewarded, not punished, a place where there is no thought police, where the state protects your right to express yourself, even if it sours foreign relations. Heaven. Just imagining it was so delicious, and yes, oh so blasphemous. Now that I cast my mind back, it was around then that you and I started dreaming of possibilities elsewhere. We looked to the West, and we were tempted by the promise of freedom. It wasn't really the freedom to dress how we wanted or to drink openly, it was the freedom to think and speak freely. The freedom to explore ideas and know that we could dare to go wherever they led us. You took off for England and made a new home there, and I, true to being the youngest who pushed the limits just a little bit further, followed a few years later, but was still restless. Sure enough, after 8 years at Oxford, I needed to move on. My adventure of teaching in South Africa lasted 2 years, and I got itchy feet again. And here I am today, in the country that prides itself on free speech as a constitutional right. You couldn't go wrong. Teaching at a small liberal arts college in the US, a place where at last I could be fully free. But as of late, I find myself wondering, am I really? With more than half the states introducing bills that ban what they construe as critical race theory in schools, state censorship is beginning to rear its head here too. Every day brings fresh news of books being banned from public schools and libraries. Just recently in Tennessee, a county board of education voted unanimously to remove Mouse, Art Spiegelman's graphic novel about the Holocaust, from the school, remove it from the school curriculum. Because of what the board deemed its unnecessary use of profanity and nudity and its depiction of violence and suicide. The board concluded the book was too adult-oriented for 8th graders. When Spiegelman heard about his book being removed, he said he got the impression that the board members were asking, why can't they teach a nicer Holocaust? Who would have thought this could happen in America? When did I first see cracks in my romance with the freedom of the academy in the West? I'd say probably 5 years into my time in the US. Our college was considering instituting a biased response team, and out of sheer curiosity, I decided to go to the town hall. What are these teams, you ask? These are committees of administrators, students, and possibly faculty to assess bias complaints, which could be filed if anyone or any group of people on campus were offended by anything said or done by others. The case is investigated, and the offending party potentially sanctioned. As I sat there listening to this proposal, which seemed to me a softer version of speech control, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing. I had a creeping sense that unwritten rules for regulating thinking and speech were rearing their heads in the US too. Couched in terms of being sensitive to others, they reeked of the kind of ideological authoritarianism and the blasphemy mindset that you and I thought we had left behind. Did we move halfway across the world, only to find ourselves fenced in yet again? Surely no educational institution in the West would entertain a move that was so deeply anti-intellectual and would chill speech on campus. It's not just college campuses, Mani. The authority of offense now reigns supreme. It's everywhere. Even art is not protected. In the spring of 2019, I read a news report about how a school board in San Francisco voted to paint over a set of stunning murals on the school walls titled Life of Washington that were painted in the 1930s by a Russian emigre. Why? Because his depiction of colonial occupation, the death of Native Americans and slavery, offended people. Some even vowed that they will not rest until these murals were permanently removed and destroyed, all because they supposedly offended and traumatized Indigenous and African American peoples. It chills me to the bone to think of the dogma that is taking root here. I know you're going to say it's just one incident, but last summer I heard that students at the University of Kentucky are protesting the Rice O'Hanlon murals on their campus. I'm just going to give you a minute to have a look at this one. This is the Rice O'Hanlon mural. And students at Vermont Law School are clamoring to cover the Underground Railroad, Vermont, and the fugitive slave. Murals made expressly to recognize Black Americans and Vermont abolitionists involved in helping enslaved people who escaped from the South. Why? Because they believe that such painful reminders of slavery should not be in a public setting. What have things come to? As if there's a predetermined way of interpreting art, as if Native Americans or African Americans have a singular sensibility. Reminds me of how people like to box in Muslims, as if all 2 billion of us are the same. Mani, the West, once that shining beacon of freedom for us, seems a lot less lustrous from where we sit now. censorship predicated on offense, once seen as the hallmark of backward cultures of the third world, appears to be a virtue of progressive thinking today. Sometimes I wonder, Mani, maybe we were the real blasphemous ones for daring to hope and imagine that heaven could, in fact, be a place on earth. And now, perhaps this is our atonement for what can be heavier than the weight of disillusionment. Yours, Amna. And now I'm going to pass it back to Jeff. We're going to shift gears from that autobiographical approach to a more formal approach where he's going to tell you why we think that free speech matters and why we think you should care about it.
All right, as I mentioned at the outset, we're going to argue that there are three basic reasons that we should all care about free expression, free speech. They are self-expression, democratic government, and the pursuit of knowledge. So when you came in, we were playing Nina Simone's song, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, which she recorded in 1967. I just want us to step back and just look at the lyrics for a moment here. So free speech, as the lyrics here underscore, doesn't just mean shouting from the mountaintops with no one to hear us. Right? Speech presumes an audience, a person or groups of people, or group of people who are worth engaging. As Ms. Simone says, I wish you could know what it means to be me. Along these lines, the rhetoric of free speech often focuses too much on the right to speak and not enough on the right to listen. Here's Frederick Douglass reflecting on this point in a famous 1860 address. To suppress free speech is a double wrong, he said. It violates the right of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear as it would be to rob him of his money. Let's turn to democratic government. Free speech, arguably, is the lifeblood of democracy. Right? A government, in Lincoln's words, of the people, by the people, for the people, depends on a mechanism by which the will of the people can be communicated. So with this depiction of a citizen rising to speak at a town hall, Norman Rockwell's 1943 painting, Freedom of Speech, illustrates this mechanism. Without free speech, you can't have debate and deliberation, two key features of democratic government. By the way, of course, when it comes to democratic government, the right to criticize people, including our leaders, is essential and another vital function of free speech in a healthy democracy. I'm going to give two quick examples from different sides of the political spectrum. The search for knowledge. The secret to finding all knowledge is to use exactly the right keywords when you Google. Right? It's not just keywords, but free speech itself, journalist Anthony Lewis contends, that is the best search engine for truth. What does that mean, a search engine for truth? Now, you actually cannot give a speech about free speech without citing John Stuart Mill. If you do, I think there's like a $1,000 penalty. So we've got the patron saint of free speech here, John Stuart Mill. He's got this tour de force publication you may have heard of, 1859, on liberty. And he makes a three-part argument regarding the centrality of free speech to truth-seeking and knowledge-building. Mill's trident is a helpful shorthand to remember this set of arguments. All right, so it's a different guy, different trident. Okay, so back to Mill. In any given question, debate, or argument, there are three possibilities. Right? The first one is, and I often find myself in this camp, you're wrong. And it's up to free speech, which helps facilitate other people to correct your view, which is mistaken. In the second case, you are partially correct. And in this case, you need free speech to have a dialogue in which contrary viewpoints can be aired and you can synthesize them to help you arrive at a more precise understanding. In the third case, you're 100% correct. Now, in that unlikely event, you still need people to argue with you, according to Mill, right? Why? Because if you never have to defend your points of view, there's a pretty good chance you don't really understand them that well. Now, I'm the parent of two young boys, and I can attest to the value and difficulty of trying to explain truths I take for granted. Truths like the world is round, what goes up must come down, and that it's unhealthy to eat popcorn for every meal. A dispute I've had with my 9-year-old pretty much on a daily basis since he was 3. Now, Mill's distinction between inheriting and adopting an idea is vital here. To me, this is the most brilliant thing that Mill ever said. He said it again. He distinguishes between inheriting and adopting an idea, right? So when you inherit an idea, you subscribe to it simply because it's what your family believes, what your peers believe, or it's conventional wisdom. When you adopt an idea, you subscribe to it because you've carefully considered it, subjecting it to critical scrutiny and analysis. Let's think about why free speech matters on college campuses, all right? All three of the reasons that I outlined are in play and pertain to the campus. With respect to self-expression and democratic government, free speech has been an essential component of student activism. Right, so historian Jonathan Zimmerman explains, only our present day myopia makes free speech look conservative or even reactionary. It was and remains a radical idea representing the only real path for emancipating ourselves. In the early 1960s, most colleges and universities severely restricted the right of students to organize and protest on campus. The students at UC Berkeley were some of the first to successfully challenge these restrictions. Some of you may recognize Mario Savio, who became leader of what became known as the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. This photograph was taken in 1964. Here's a zoomed out photograph of the same scene. Because of student advocacy at Berkeley and campuses across the country, students won basic free speech rights. Without these rights, students wouldn't have been able to participate and advance all of these things. The Vietnam anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, which was a big deal coming up in the 1980s. I saw anti-apartheid demonstrations on campuses across the country. The Black Lives Matter movement. Now, with all of the attention that we pay to speech that is potentially harmful or offensive today, I want to highlight that provoking and offending people is central to all activist movements. Right? You are not going to be able to capture people's attention without making waves. So over the past 50 years, student protesters have offended all sorts of people. This is just a really short list. Faculty, staff, administrators, ministers, preachers, politicians, local, state, and federal government officials, members of the armed forces, the police, their own peers, and most importantly, their own parents. Okay? Consider what just happened in Washington, D.C. this past weekend at George Washington University. To coincide with the Olympic opening ceremonies, the following posters were put up around campus. So, as you can see, these posters critique the human rights abuses being perpetrated by the Chinese government, emphasizing the Communist Party's horrific treatment of Uyghurs and Tibetans in particular. This is the flag of East Turkestan. which is the northwestern part of China. Chinese people call it, the state of China calls it Xinjiang. The people who live there are ethnic minorities, Uyghurs who practice Islam. You see the Tibetan monk being assaulted in the panel in the upper right-hand corner. So this went up on the campus at George Washington University. And the Chinese Cultural Association at GW wrote an open letter to the administration and the president, claiming that the images were racist and had insulted China and discriminated against Asians, that they were so offensive they needed to be taken down immediately. The student or students responsible should be investigated and, quote, severely punished, unquote. The posters were taken down initially, and the president released a statement saying that there would be an investigation. After a firestorm on social media, he walked that back and just this morning made a public announcement that GW is committed to free speech and there will be no investigation. But you can see, as depicted here, offense, causing offense, making a ruckus, all essential components to the political activism component. All right, so activism is important, but it's not usually the reason we come to college. So why are we here? I see at least a few students in the audience here. Now let's imagine you arrived at NDSU as a first-year student, and you were brought into the new multi-million-dollar facility that is the NDSU Indoor Theme Park. You spent 4 years, inside the theme park, riding the roller coaster, partying with your peers. You finally stumble out of the park. 4 years later, worse for the wear, none the wiser. Somebody hands you a diploma and says, "Congratulations, you are now officially a college graduate." Unfortunately, that may describe what happens at college for many people, not just at NDSU. What's wrong with this picture? There are all sorts of things wrong with that picture, to be sure, but one of the main problems is that the diploma wouldn't really mean anything. It's supposed to be a sign of an education rather than simply doing the requisite time. So what does it mean to be educated? To be an educated person is to change your mind over and over and over again as you grow, learn, and develop. We would argue that you don't just have the right, but you have the obligation to change your mind if you're on a college campus. Especially true for students, but goes for people like me who are faculty members, right? So I'm in the field of educational studies. New scholarship is always coming out. New educational policies are being formulated and rolled out all the time. It requires continual analysis, reflection, and revision to stay current and stay sharp in my field. There's not a single class that I've taught where through conversations with students, I don't change my mind in some way. Not as much as the students do, because I've been thinking about it for longer, but I absolutely end up in a different place from where I started. When it comes to changing our minds in an educational context, I like this quote from former University of Chicago President Hannah Gray. Education should not be intended to make people comfortable. It's meant to make them think. Universities should be expected to provide the conditions within which hard thought, and therefore strong disagreement, independent judgment, and the questioning of stubborn assumptions can flourish in an environment of the greatest freedom. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a look at a concrete example. It doesn't come from campus, but all of the key principles and dynamics are relevant to campus life and are still in play. It's the year 2000. I'm on a train traveling from Madrid to Barcelona with a friend of mine from the Czech Republic. Her name was Petra. We found ourselves in a small compartment with two men about our same age. I was in my early 20s, and we struck up a conversation. Turns out they were from Pakistan, where Amna is originally from. After a few minutes of chit-chat, keeping in mind that we have a 6 or 7 hour train ride ahead of us, Petra turns to them and says, "Pakistan, huh? What's up with how you treat gay people in Pakistan?" Now the guys recoiled, and one of them said, "Well, we don't have any gay people in Pakistan." Petra laughed out loud and said, give me a break, that's ridiculous. What ensued was an intense, sometimes intense, discussion about homosexuality, Islam, marriage, and child rearing in Pakistan. In the end, the two men conceded that gay people did in fact exist in Pakistan, but they never acted on their desires and had to live quote unquote normal lives in heterosexual marriages. Now I'm feeling very self-satisfied and smug about how enlightened the United States is compared to Pakistan. One of the men turns to me and he says, hey, it's Jeff, right? Yeah, Jeff. Yeah, hey, what's up with how you treat old people in the United States? I said, what do you mean? He said, is it true that you send your aging parents to old age homes? Well, sure, I said. He said, how can you do that to your parents? You send your loved ones away to live with strangers, your own flesh and blood, because you're too busy or selfish to care for them? Okay, now I was affronted and feeling more than a little defensive. What ensued was an intense, sometimes tense, discussion about nuclear versus extended families, attitudes toward the elderly, familial love and responsibility in the United States. This exchange was hugely educational for me, opening my eyes to question cultural practices I took for granted. I like to think it was also educational for the guys from Pakistan as well. It most definitively was not comfortable. That's one thing it was not. But for whatever reason, we were able to have a free and open discussion with a robust exchange of views, claims, and positions. We came out on the other side smarter, stronger, better informed. If we hadn't been able to speak freely, if we had cut short the conversation at the first sign of discomfort or offense, an invaluable educational opportunity would have been lost. All right, so I'll close with this. If we want the recipe for the most powerful and transformative educational opportunities on college campuses, free speech is an absolutely essential ingredient. Thanks to you all for listening, and we are eager to hear your questions. Thank you.
So rather informal here, so just raise your hand.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an excellent presentation. Thought it reflected a lot of the things that I have concerns about myself. I don't think there was a single example to which I have objections. With the small caveat, I think some of the examples you gave, there are sort of going to more extreme cases, arguments on both sides for free speech. And let me take the example of people on pedestals. I mean, some of the people who, some of the same kinds of conflicts, like asking for murals to be removed. There are also requests for people who, for monuments to be of slaveholders, so to be removed. There might be a rather small step between the mural and the general who is a slaveholder and who is on a pedestal. Coming from Germany, in Germany, the Nazi leadership was never placed on. There were never any monuments made, and luckily, I mean, the Allied forces, including the U.S., probably had some say in that, and the Germans who then took control after the war did. I think it would be a terrible thing if there were any monuments honoring Nazis. And in fact, I would argue it is a free speech point that there ought not be such monuments, because if you saw a Nazi standing there, you would feel intimidated to use free speech, because the Nazi prohibited free speech. So it is, I think there are cases where, so I don't think there are really people who, many people in the US who say we don't like free speech. It's just that the people who sometimes end up being on the opposing side of what you're presenting have their own reasons for arguing that what possibly even with free speech. So how do you feel about slaveholders on pedestals?
Actually, it's interesting. I teach a history course, a history methods course, and we discuss that at length. And I would argue that I think your way of responding to a Confederate monument on a pedestal may be one. I think I would see it, and today, in fact, in Dennis's class, there was a student who said the point of a monument, we had this conversation, is to show how far we've come. That's how he was interpreting it, and that we no longer are in a society where this kind of individual is revered or honored. But there was a time when he was, and I say he because they were all men. And I just think that there are different approaches. There's no definitive way to settle this question. Historians are split on this about what to do with monuments, and I do think that ultimately it comes down to a conversation that the city needs to have about how you want to approach these issues. But I think I push back a little bit, and I don't think it's that definitively clear to my mind that indeed they must all be removed. I think there are arguments to be made for them as prime resources to stay in the places they are in, not because I think they're wonderful, but because I think there are people who would, for a historical reason, not for an ideological or political reason, would say that.
So let me make a couple additional comments. One, what's your name? And yeah, I appreciate the question. You said, these monuments and sculptures on pedestals. The best, in my view, possible answer or solution or approach to this was to just take them off the pedestals. Literally remove the pedestals, bring the Confederate generals down to size, cut them down to size, so rather than looming over you, they're there. That was just...
And as a matter of fact, sorry for jumping in again,
Yeah.
that was what was done in Germany. Any monument that was, did change that power balance.
Yes.
So I like
But-
that solution.
But in addition to that, one of the problems with monuments like that is that if there is a sign, it's 100 years old or 80 years old, and it's the context that was provided by the people who put up the monument, many of which are monuments to white supremacy, the Confederate monuments across the southern states, you need additional context. You can always add additional context. Some cities have taken a strategy where they say, okay, we've got this monument, we're going to provide context, and we're going to put up a new monument. We're going to put up a monument of black soldiers who fought in the Civil War. We're going to put up a monument of African American suffragists or whatever. So I think there are multiple ways of approaching that. I think from a free speech perspective, I don't think there's anybody that I'm aware of who's a serious proponent of free speech who would say just leave them as is. Certainly as a historian, I would say contextualize them. And as a citizen, I have no problem. Cut them down to size. But to destroy them, to me as a historian, destroying any primary source, whatever it is, you never get it back. You can't. It's a lost opportunity.
Having said that, I can also see that a city might have, as long as we have a robust conversation about it, and they may decide to remove it.
Yeah,
And
move it
that's-
to a museum. There are
that's
other
fine.
possible solutions, I think.
I think one of the bigger problems we have in free speech is the ability to listen. You hit that real well. And an open mind. How in the world can you listen with an open mind? Now, of course, your value systems and their value systems are going to be considerably different. And most of the times that I've had to deal with people, it's not the argument, it's the closed mind. That's the primary problem. How do we deal with a closed mind?
I mean, let me give an answer that's a way of attempting to sort of evade the question and make it easier. So if you set this in an educational context, I think there are easier and kind of more productive answers. I mean, to my mind, as a professor, I think you can do a lot of modeling in front of the classroom to present a range of different viewpoints that are supported by evidence, right? If there's a way in which a classroom discussion or a particular topic is becoming too ideological or kind of too much of a little mini echo chamber, I think profs have the responsibility and should take the initiative to say, well, hey, can anyone imagine what an opposing view is? Right, so I think you can create a context inside of a classroom, but the public sphere?
Yeah, that's where it's at.
Actually, I have something to say about the public sphere. I think, your question is $1 million question, because if we could figure the answer out to that, we'd be talking to the Taliban and we wouldn't have had 20 years of occupation in Afghanistan. But, in the event that we don't have the $1 million answer, I'd say public discourse in the US right now is, there's a lot of imprecise use of language. And terms have lost their meaning. And I think to have a more productive conversation, we need to be more specific about what we mean by particular terms. So white supremacy now means everything and nothing, right? Harm means everything and nothing. So all of these terms, we've become a loose society in how we use language. And to bring it back to a more productive conversation in the public sphere, I think what we can do is try and be more specific about what we're saying, and when we're engaging, say, well, what exactly do you mean? Push people to articulate themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Everybody in this room agrees that we need free speech, period. I mean, there isn't any question about that. Everything up on that screen, I would guess everyone agrees with that. The question is, in my mind, what are the limits on free speech? There are limits on every right that we have in this country, whether it's speech or religion or whatever. And we're talking in so many generalities here today. Now, Justice Holmes said, you cannot falsely claim fire in a crowded theater because of the terrible risk of life. You cannot publish the movement of a troop ship coming out of a specific port during wartime because of the extreme risk. But there are all kinds of other limitations on the use of free speech. We can't assume it's a blank right. There are limits and specific limits, and there have to be limits. Let me just say one more thing. Does it matter whether the thing you say is true or not? Do you have a right to lie? Does that make a difference? So I'll let it go at that.
Well, let me start with the right to lie question. Just briefly, Amna and I are going to do another talk on academic freedom in about a month. And so here, I think there's a distinction to be made between free speech and academic freedom. Free speech lies generally, unless it's slander or defaming somebody, or immaterial. If I stand on the street corner with a sign in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I live, and the sign says the world is flat, right? That's totally fine. It's not true, right? But nobody's going to come and lock me up. If I'm a geologist at NDSU and I walk in on the first day of class and say, all right, welcome to Geology 101. As we all know, the world is flat. Don't believe the hype. Don't believe the lies. It's a conspiracy. The world is not round. Lying matters. Truth matters. Accuracy matters in a classroom context in a way that it does not beyond the classroom. So that's a distinction that I would make, and I think it's a distinction that's often lost because people think about the academic freedom of professors or of students. In an educational context on a campus, in a classroom, it's not 100% elastic, right? I'm an educational studies prof. I can't go into my classroom and teach, how to play the trombone. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not going to talk about public health issues, not my area of expertise. So I think the context is super important there in terms of the truth or accuracy of a particular statement. Do you want to?
That's in an educational context, and again, we have another talk on academic freedom where we'll flesh that out more. But I think more broadly in the public sphere, I think there are limitations, absolutely. It's not a complete free-for-all. If you're going to incite violence, or if you're going to create, certain kinds of panic, like you were saying, Justice Holmes' statement, there are limitations to that. But the question is, and this has become a very relevant question for our times, what do we do with misinformation and with fake news, which has been talked about? And what's interesting is, particularly on social media, which compounds the problem, and there's a book that's just been released today called Free Speech from Socrates to Social Media by Jacob Mishingama. And he actually looks at some of the research on misinformation and finds, and I was interested to see this, that there are negative effects, but they're not as blatant or as much as we would have thought that they will be. And that is an interesting, the empirical evidence seems to suggest that yes, misinformation, but it wasn't nearly as rampant as we think it was. And that I think is interesting. So the question is, do we, in light of that, constrain free speech, which has a lot of benefits to control the lies that are out there, but they're not as pervasive as we thought they were? But is it important to us that it is always truth that is spoken of? And then I will posit the question, what you consider true changes over time. So if we were to use that as our yardstick, Galileo will certainly not be able to say what he was trying to say.
Let me try. What's your name, sir?
Rolf.
Ralph. Yeah, to bring Ralph and Ann's comment and conversation with one another, one of the fundamental ways that the United States is different from other Western countries when it comes to free expression is, in spite of what my students say, we don't have a hate speech exemption in the United States. There is no such thing as hate speech, according to the United States Constitution and jurisprudence, right? But in places like Germany and France, it's actually illegal, and people have been thrown in jail for denying that the Holocaust happened, right? In the United States, we don't do that. So that's interesting. And Europeans, I think, look over here and say, you're the outlier here. To defend the American position, which no surprise, I'm a fan of, when you see hate speech laws put into place, you end up with situations like what happened in Russia in 2015. They had a similar ban of any kind of, it was denial of the Holocaust. They also banned all associated imagery. Nazi imagery was completely banned from public view. What was the first thing that was removed from circulation in Russia in 2015 when that happened? It was Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, about his father's experience at Auschwitz and the Holocaust, because there's actually a swastika on the cover of that book. And copies of that book were confiscated and removed. Right, so I can see with the hate speech law, that's really tricky. When you're talking about limits, you talk to Europeans, they think we're nuts, and that we don't have these, we don't have a hate speech exemption, right? That we can insult people based on the racial background or the religious heritage. That's not the same case in places like Germany. But can I say, sorry, can I quickly, what's your name, sir?
Me?
Yeah.
Walt.
To Walt's point about how do we do this in the public discourse when people's minds are so closed, one of the things that I'm perplexed as a professor is that it's now a virtue in the United States to have maintained the same position throughout your career, right? And it's a gotcha. Oh my God, John Kerry flip-flopped. In 1971, he said this about the Vietnam War. 40 years later, he's changed his mind. It's like, thank God, right? He did some reading, like the world changed. Like we change our minds about science, things change, there's progress, we have a better understanding of history. And I don't see why this is seen as a fault, right, as a shortcoming, a sort of moral or intellectual shortcoming. So I think a little bit of a tension of fallibility, that we have the right to change our minds. So to me, as soon as you get into those public conversations with the people, the doors come down. Part of that, I think, is the illusion that people want to maintain intellectual consistency. I just don't think we need to hold that as our preeminent value. We should be much more flexible. Sorry, but I just wanted to
I
respond.
like that idea of emphasis of growth.
Yes, growth.
If you don't grow intellectually, why are you here?
Exactly, yeah.
Tyler, there's some questions from
Yes.
Cyber World.
Thank you. We do have one online from Ganapathy who says, free speech on academic campuses suffers not because of suppression, but because of the inhibitory forces of the retaliation and recrimination that are more often than not exercised covertly. He asked, how can champions of free speech deal with these forces that rear up even against minor blasphemies? Free speech is allowed, but it is controlled by the covert retaliation and recrimination.
If I understand that question correctly, what I'm hearing is that it's not necessarily that there's censorship from the dean's office or the state of North Dakota, but that it's kind of pressure from your peers, pressures to conform, a kind of peer pressure echo chamber. That's how I'm understanding.
Well, with that, I'm reminded from that question of Lindsay Shepherd in Canada, Laurier University, where the university official, maybe this is what this person was talking about, the official position was that Lindsay Shepherd had done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
But didn't really reprimand any of the professors, administrators involved. And as she continued onward, she was continually kind of blacklisted by professors, and maybe that's what they were kind of talking about. So that wasn't an official position of the university, but that's what happened to her.
I think there are a couple of things here, right? I think you can have all the policies in the world that you want, but if you don't foster that culture, it's not going to happen. And I think many universities right now are on that, they find themselves, I think administrations in particular, kind of saying one thing, but then not being able to hold to it in practice. And the biggest thing we need, and I find spineless educational leaders the most hideous thing right now. We don't need amoeba, we need people who can stand up and speak to the value of academic freedom on a campus, because that, to my mind, is vital for what we do. It's not something we can compromise, not a value that under any circumstances I'm willing to compromise, because it fundamentally goes against what we may as well pack up shop. So to my mind, I'd say fostering that culture is vital, and that's not just the administration's responsibility, though they can model it and is very much on the shoulders of administrators, but it's also among students, it's among faculty, and you have to cultivate a culture for a free-flowing conversation. I was so delighted to hear that it's the student government here that sponsored this event in part, because it's like students paying attention to things that matter. And that's the kind of interest that is necessary to create those spaces and that culture where these conversations can take place.
But of course, there are limits on academic freedom too.
Of course. For the next talk, when we talk about academic freedom. I
Is
hope
the
you'll come.
conversation clarified, Tyler?
Free speech on academic campus is controlled not by suppression, but by retaliation and recrimination. Free expression is allowed. Sort of the same question he just asked, how would you fight this then? Retaliation, recrimination.
By creating more spaces and actively, in whichever capacity you are, to push for it, to kind of push to have conversations that are supposedly not kosher according to some.
I also think, asking ourselves, asking a campus community, asking the students, asking the faculty, to consider how we want to make sense of occasions when there are sharp disagreements or somebody has said something that's allegedly offensive, right? Maybe it might just be one part of a phrase from a tweet. But do you want, I guess it's sort of a golden rule type approach. Do you want to be treated with the same degree or the same lack of generosity, right? And kind of the inability to forgive, the pigeonholing. You once said this, you are a blasphemer, or you're beyond the pale of our community. I think as a society, we're too quickly to go a very punitive route. And there should be more of a spirit of generosity. And that's not something that can be mandated from the top down, right? You can't have a college president be like, all right, let's all be humble and generous. That in some ways has to be driven by peers. That has to be driven by faculty who model that behavior. But I do think that that's one of the issues here. I mean, in my time, just the last 10 years in higher ed, there's so little space to make a quote unquote mistake. People do get called out. Loretta Ross, the black feminist, calls this kind of the two elements of social media. There's the unforgettability aspect, if you post something, and then there's the unforgivability part, right? She calls this a toxic, kind of 1-2 punch that you see with cancel culture, quote unquote, as she calls it.
Can I just, I'd like to address that more by saying to students in particular, if I could, sometimes we have, and in fact often, demands for things like bias response teams. They're all very well intentioned. I don't question the intention. But they're actually coming from students. And for students who are keen to have a culture of free expression, they need to see how these have chilling effects on. So even though the intention may be good, it goes against what essentially is the goal of what we're trying to do. So students should think carefully and not run to administrators and ask for these things about speech. Rather, foster a culture of having conversation amongst themselves. Administrators are, they make administrative moves. That's what they're there for. And then you're going to be stuck with these administrative moves.
Could I just break in? I want to make sure students get to ask questions too.
Sure.
So if there's a student who wants to ask a question, we can take that. If not, we can just keep going.
Well, I don't know. So actually when you brought up the whole posters at George Washington, so I actually had not heard that yet, but I shouldn't assume it. Have you guys heard of the whole Joe Rogan Spotify thing going on? So with the whole censorship, or I mean the lack of censorship thereof, what are you guys' opinions on that? I know what Neil Young pulled his music. I just feel like that's it's intolerance to a certain extent.
So
Do you want our personal takes on this?
Yeah, no, I'd love.
Can I give a quick answer?
Yeah.
With the Joe Rogan thing and many other of these free speech controversies, I think you see two camps develop. And one would be a more top-down censorship model where you say, okay, there's misinformation in the world, right? We're going to control that misinformation before it gets out into the world, right? And then there's a competing school of thought that would say, okay, there's always going to be misinformation. The responsibility isn't necessarily on the content creator, on Joe Rogan, on Spotify, on Biden or Trump to always be speaking truthfully. The responsibility is on the citizen, the person who's reading, the person who's listening. And the idea there is, let's better educate the public. Let's create stronger information literacy skills, stronger skills in terms of identifying sources and what's a primary source. So I'm actually generally, I guess I shouldn't be surprised anymore at this point, but I'm on the left, I'm a social progressive in many ways. A lot of my lefty friends, they want to take this top-down approach and say, no, the people can't handle this kind of information. The experts, the enlightened people, we need to make these decisions and make sure that COVID misinformation isn't spread out there, make sure that racist ideas don't spread. To my mind, it's no. Power to the people, actually empower them. Give them stronger literacy skills, invest more in public education, right? So it's kind of, there's different ways that you can tackle that problem, and I'm always very skeptical of the top-down approach, because then it's who's in the room, right? I don't trust myself. If Google said to me, or Facebook, Zuck calls me up, Mark Zuckerberg calls me up, he's like, hey Jeff, you're now in charge of all Facebook censorship and misinformation. I don't even trust myself to do that job, even with an army of 100 people. 1,000 people. I just don't think you can do it effectively, and it makes much more sense to me, what's your name?
Lydia.
To say, hey, Lydia, I'm not gonna try and control what Lydia sees or reads or the films that she watches. I'm gonna give Lydia the best education that I can so she can make up her own mind and parse the information herself. So in some ways, this is sort of, it's an elitist populist thing, and I guess maybe I'm more on the populist side here. Maybe that's not quite the right word for it, but sorry, you were gonna say something?
I was just going to say, on the Joe Rogan thing, to my mind, it's the most uninteresting conversation that we're having, and people are spending so much airtime on it. Because Spotify is a private platform. They choose to keep him on. Other people choose to take their music off. Fine, whatever. We could be spending this time having a much more interesting conversation about things that matter. Yet we choose to focus on these tiny little things and then get so
No, but
territorial.
let me push back on you.
Okay.
Let me push back on you, though, because for those, are people roughly familiar with the Joe Rogan Spotify thing? Because my lefty friends are saying, oh my God, there are thousands of people who have died because of the COVID misinformation that Rogan is peddling on his show that reaches, 11 million people every week. That seems like a big deal.
Yeah, I'd like to see the data for that. B, I'd just say Joe Rogan isn't peddling that information. He is giving a platform for different people to speak, including people who will say vaccines are very important. So, to my mind, that kind of argument is again a shutting down, which is not really productive for us. Students and then you.
So this was incredibly interesting. I really appreciated how you brought up how you portray yourself, how you speak your words effectively and precisely contributes a lot to how you are taken. So a lot of this, I aspire to be a psychologist, so I view things through that lens. A lot of this reminds me of temperament readings, like if you know the Big Five, Costa and McRae network, and then so you have people who are raised and who naturally have certain temperaments. How do we implement initial procedures to make sure that they can speak to others who do not process things the same way, so that we can be more effective in our communication, and so that we can be more tolerant because we have open minds through that speech? You don't have to be an expert on this. I just am.
No, but actually, this is a really good question. If I can, I think the Socratic method, even in conversation, is probably the best way, where you're not just telegraphing what you think, but actually are inviting questions, and those questions then provide the space to engage in a way where you're not just throwing terms at each other. When you're like, oh, you said that. What did you exactly mean by that? And I think that opens up a space for people with different temperaments to take a minute, be forced to think what they mean, and say it, or make correction. But actually, I didn't mean it that way. So many interesting conversations happen in that fashion, in my mind. Sorry, go on.
May hold up, I'm so sorry. But I have two concerns about the Socratic method, which is that people who are closed might not even want to hear somebody questioning them, and people who are agreeable might just roll over and play dead as soon as a question comes up.
I don't
Do we accommodate this?
I don't deny that is the case. I think the idea that we will all be able to communicate effectively across all kinds is perhaps it's a different kind of communication we need then. It's not words, right? Which is why I think art is incredibly important. Which is why I think theater is important. Which is why I think other modes of communication are important. One of the reasons we did the presentation we did it the way we did, which is me reading a letter, I feel like that reaches people in a completely different way than something like a formal presentation. The letter kind of opens people up, disarms them, gives them an idea of, at least that's what I'm hoping, gives them an idea of where I'm coming from. It humanizes my position. And then we can perhaps talk about it more effectively. So literature, I think that we have to, and this is the beauty of being the liberal arts model is fantastic, because I think it allows for more modes of engagement and communication than perhaps just a lecturing model and where we kind of close things off in fields.
What's your name?
Sage.
Sage.
Oh,
Yeah. Just a quick follow-up. If my mom's watching, I haven't gotten this tattoo yet, Mom, but if I do get a tattoo, it's going to say, message intended does not equal message received. This, if I have any wisdom, that's it. That should be on my tombstone. Message intended does not equal message received. There are so many occasions in which it's crystal clear what I'm saying, but you're not getting it. And precisely all of the strategies that Amna said, what I would do in a teaching situation, right, is the first thing you do if you want to disagree with somebody's point, rather than just coming in and saying, you know what, I disagree for these reasons. Hey, Sage, here's what I'm understanding. Is this what you meant, right? These clarification questions. Like there's a lot of this beyond, the laws and what the First Amendment says. So much of this is about social norms in a classroom. It's about the kinds of protocols and the way that you run your classroom. And there's no real exact handbook for that. And some of it comes down to these cliches, right? Like try and listen to one another. But I do think that is a fundamental problem, that people receive information differently, the different modalities that you're describing. Somebody may feel comfortable writing but not speaking up in class. So yeah, as a teacher, I would be cognizant of that. Again, how do you deal with that in a broader public sphere? Some people are going to be more likely to stand up at a public meeting. They're more extroverted. It's hard to kind of make it a level playing field for every person to feel equally confident and capable of speaking up.
In every context, I'd say,
Yeah.
It's hard to make it possible that in every context, everyone there feels equally able to participate. But I think the way to counter that is to create more and more spaces where people engage differently. Hence my emphasis on art and other, so our aim should be to create more of those sites where people can do things differently. And I love, Dennis's class this morning. It's a intro to philosophy class. They're reading The Color Purple and doing it how fabulous is that? And I think a lot of professors use different techniques to do that. And that it's an attempt to try and reach in a different way students who may not feel analytically inclined to argue, Anne had a question, now I'll come to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a follow-up on the Spotify issue. I mean, Spotify is not a physical space, so that's why I think it's different. And so in some ways I disagree with both of you on that. Retroactively, I do think it's extremely important, and I don't think it's a free speech issue. I think it's a pedestal issue. I mean, how did it happen that Spotify put Joe Rogan on that pedestal? And I mean, the reason it happened is because they made money from it. And so that's, they wouldn't have to recommend him quite as well. And I mean, it's the recommender systems, and I'm a computer scientist, so I take the blame, so I think it's not a...
You shouldn't have designed those algorithms, Anne.
No, I see what you're saying, but I would still, I like to err on the side, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, on the side of agency. I mean, I do feel like, yes, there are recommendations that pop on my screen all the time. I hardly ever click on them. Like, there is some agency that I have in this, and people can choose not to listen. People can choose to boycott.
What were you going to say? I interrupted you.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to provide the alternative interpretation that it may be less of a free speech issue. It may be a very important issue. It may be less of a free speech issue, but it may also fit into the original comment about the pedestal. I mean, I think when talking about free speech, sometimes the issue of a pedestal is not given enough attention.
Yep.
Yes, it's very valuable.
Sorry, but we had a question here.
Hi, my name is Oren, if it's important. I think that free speech is a different subject than equal speech. And if you think that the reason for free speech is because ultimately it makes democracy stronger, then I would say, look at the US, look at every democratic country in the world and ask yourself, are we becoming more democratic? It seems to me we're becoming less democratic by the day if you look at, say, the laws that are being passed to prohibit teaching of students, laws that prevent public health officials from doing the scientific thing and enforcing mask mandates and vaccine mandates. And a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court came out with a ruling that said that money is the same as free speech, and basically it allowed wealthy individuals to secretly fund what looks superficially like a bunch of individuals' free speech, but perhaps may in the end just be one Medusa head with 100 snake heads out there all saying the same thing and getting by with the cover of free speech, but yet we see that, you know, what we have as a country and the world is coming apart at the seams right now, the truckers protesting, and so it seems like free speech is not protecting democracy. And so you mentioned that, well, you can't tell the truth from the lies because who's going to be the expert? People say that. Well, I guess that I'm a believer in democracy in the small letter word, where we have a representative republic, which is not a democracy in the long term, if you looked at what it would be if everybody had a right to vote on every issue. So, and we don't seem to be going as a world or heading as a democracy towards that ideal. We seem to be heading in the opposite direction with Rogan and some of these other racists and so on that are coming out on, you know, they got hundreds of millions of dollars that somebody thinks is probably because it attracts advertising. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem like that free speech is taking us on the right path. And at some point, it seems like, you know, the time for talking is over and you take a vote. And in a democracy, for it to work, everybody that's participating has to agree to go along with the result, even if it might not be personally. And then maybe there'll be another vote later on, but we don't seem to have that now, where we people don't think that Biden is a legitimate president, and they're going to arms about it. And I think we just see the future, and, you know, heading into the global warming, as things are not going to get easier. All your solutions seem to be focused on, well, the university's got to encourage free speech and philosophy classes and so on, but 99% of the world is not going to ever go to a philosophy class where they have that. And universities themselves are falling apart. Look at the declining enrollment here, the increasing costs. How much longer can you say that universities are even going to be important in society? So it seems to me that there needs, if you want to protect democracy and kind of save the future, there's got to be something more than just a carte blanche, free speech is always right no matter what, because I think it's been weaponized, and money is used to make sure that some free speech gets more hearing than other free speech.
And I think you just answered exactly what I would have said, that I think free speech has been weaponized. And I think it's not free speech that is the problem, it is the way it's being used, and the way, that Supreme Court decision, I think, is a problem, you know, and that is not free speech, that is tampering with free speech. So I feel like it's not because of free speech that we are in this moment, it's because we are not actually doing it in the spirit of free speech, and we're just weaponizing it to serve whatever purpose can be served, that we're in the situation we're in. So to my mind, and this is why to my mind, universities become the bastion of preserving, we should fight tooth and nail to preserve this space, because it's being eroded very rapidly because of the way in which free speech has been weaponized. And we shouldn't let it. My problem with people on the left and liberals is that they've started seeing free speech as a right issue, and they've kind of given it up. I'm like, hell no, this is my issue, and I am not giving it up. It's not a left-right issue. It's us as a democracy issue, small d democracy issue. So I think the trouble is, again, about, you know, people weaponizing words. It's becoming imprecise. It's being misused. That's what I would say.
And just to add on to that, I would say that, you know, free speech is no guarantee that things are going to turn out well. I just think that the alternative is almost always worse, right? So whenever I think people raise all the issues that you just did, I mean, some of them, to me, the answer isn't, hey, let's celebrate the First Amendment. The answer is political activism, right? Is organizing, is running for your local school board. It's only loosely related to free speech. But I do think the smartest people I've heard critique the state of free expression and the First Amendment in the United States, when they say, okay, you've outlined all these really important problems, what's your alternative? I've never heard a compelling alternative, and they often end up with, well, we don't want to go the censorship route. So yeah, I don't think it's a guarantee. What is the famous Churchill quote about democracy?
I don't know which one you're talking about. The man had so many quotes, but Sorry, but I was just actually going to say, when you were saying running for school board isn't related to free speech, I'd say it precisely is, because you have a voice there. You know, it's the space to have a voice, and you can go and use it. So that's what I would urge people to do, and I agree, there are problems, but I don't think the problem is with the principle of free speech per se.
Exactly.
That's what my response would be.
Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried.
Well, there you go. Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, free speech versus censorship.
Question from the cyber world.
From the cyber world, we have Jeffrey Godfrey, who was wondering about kind of that introductory slide about the three bullets: self-expression, democratic government, and pursuit of knowledge. I was wondering, is that intended to be the definition of free speech or a requirement for free speech?
I think it's a definition or a requirement per se. To me, it's objectives, aspirations, and ideals that free speech can facilitate. Not invariably, not always, but certainly as an academic, if you're talking about a regime that is, free expression versus one that's more censorious in terms of doing scientific research, teaching, free expression and a culture of free expression, in my view, 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up with better, higher quality research, a wider range of topics that you're able to investigate. So yeah, I think those are kind of positive goods, or not positive goods.
Those are the reasons why we need free speech. Those are the positive end goals which show us that free speech is a good thing.
I'd like to follow up on that if possible.
Whoa.
Sure. Are you a disembodied voice from the cyber world?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We're feeling very
Okay,
Star Trek-y. Go on.
I feel much better with that clarification because those things as a consequence of free speech, that makes more sense. But Amna, I believe earlier you were actually speaking about kind of a problem in modern day society, which was like an ambiguity when it comes to like the definition of words. And so I wanted to look at free speech in general. Like the word free means something uncontrolled, unrestrained, without resistance, right? So if we were looking at that definition of free speech, I should be able to say yell out fire in a movie theater or bomb in an airport because that's uncontrolled, uninhibited speech. And I feel we have some form of speech, however, it's not free speech. It is censored because automatically defining free speech in itself is a censorship. Like when you look at our Constitution, we're guaranteed protections for certain forms of self-expression or physical speech. However, what about the other ones? Those are not protected. Therefore, it's not truly, genuinely free speech.
Well, I actually would challenge you on your definition of what free is. I mean, there's freedom to and there's freedom from. And I think we need to think, this is exactly why we need to talk about terms more precisely, is what do we understand by free speech? How are we thinking about free speech? And to think about freedom in the absence of parameters is meaningless in some ways. So I don't think that free speech in my mind isn't the free, like willy-nilly go and do whatever you want. And it's also a right. And in my mind, perhaps because I'm informed by Eastern philosophy, a right comes with responsibility. It's not independent of that. And that responsibility to, has the that's what kind of shapes the parameters of the right.
I would just briefly add to that. I feel like I'm speaking. I'm like on the Star Trek, voices being then. Even free speech absolutists, right? So claimed, self-proclaimed free speech absolutists actually do believe in all sorts of restrictions. I don't know a single so-called free speech absolutist who's in favor of allowing child pornography to be sold and conveyed. So I think there is an important point here that it goes beyond the literal interpretation of the words, which I think is at least worth noting. Even the most diehard proponents, if you push them hard enough, they will land somewhere and say, oh yeah, no, that should be restricted.
Would you be willing to give a definition of what free speech is then?
I don't think I could do it coherently off the top of my head, but if you find me over email, I'm happy to be in conversation with you about this.
I'm going to take a stab at
Okay.
that. I think it's the freedom to express a relevant point of view, right? Something that is on the table, not just random stuff that's disconnected, without fear of reprisal for your position, for your like ideological position or your opinion. So the freedom to be able to express that without thinking that you're going to be punished for it. And to my mind, people talk about self-censorship. I think we all self-censor. We're polite people. We're not going to go around and say, hey, you have a terrible haircut today. You know, we don't do that. But there's a difference between being
It's true in my
polite.
case, unfortunately.
There's a difference in, that's not self-censorship per se, in that we are not self-censoring ideas that are necessary to advance the conversation forward about something that is consequential. I mean, your haircut may be very consequential to you, but it's really not that. That's not what in my mind is self-censorship. It's when we stop saying things because we're scared that what we're going to put forward is going to have repercussions of a negative sort on us. Does that help?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can bring up relativism, but I'm not going to. I think that's a pretty good definition to keep.
I'll take on relativism another time.
We have time for one more question.
Is there anybody in here who has not had a chance to speak up, who would like to pose a question?
In here or out there? Okay, well then we have these two. You guys can have a duel and decide which one of you wants to go. That's how we're going to settle this dispute.
What I find fascinating, the whole free speech thing, is my attitude toward the other person. If I treat the other person with respect, I will function well. If I have background, animosity, and all kinds of other baggage, free speech will never work. And I think what I'm saying, if we put it in different terms, we're moving from an egocentric to an altruistic philosophy of speech.
I think one of the most important things we have to keep in mind, each of us, is that we might be wrong. And if we could possibly be wrong, then we might learn in listening to the other person.
Surely not.
But it's possible.
Well, that's a better summary than either of us could do, those two comments paired together. So.
Well, I'm going to bring our event to a close because that's my responsibility to be always savvy in these particular situations. So once again, I want to remind folks this event is being recorded. After editing, it will be made available for free on the NPEI's YouTube channel. There are other videos of previous events there, such as our Learning the Language of Diversity and Meaningful Inclusion series, so there's lots of things to watch if you'd like to go there. I'd like to thank our sponsors once again of Tri-College Universities, Humanities, North Dakota, the North and NDSU Student Government, the College of Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences. And I'd like to especially welcome or thank our speakers who will be here, not at the university, but will be back on March 1st for the Academic Freedom one. And Ann Denton is going to be using freedom of speech and academic freedom in about 2 weeks when she talks about the Sky Daddy. Although that's no longer the name of her talk. But anyways, let's thank our speakers for a wonderful job.